So continuing on with our outstanding guest speaker series, today the TMCC Library Open Genealogy Lab is proud to welcome back Senior Professor of History, Robert S. Davis. Robert has built a research collection at the Wallace State Community College, Hanceville, Alabama, that pioneers promoting and teaching local and family history in a college environment. He holds a Master of Education degree in History from the University of North Georgia and a Master of Arts degree from the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Bob has more than 1,250 publications on records and research, as well as various appearances on television. His work has received numerous awards, and he has spoken to hundreds of groups across the country. Today's lecture is titled The Strange World of the Revolutionary War Research in the Old South. So without further ado, I would love to offer a warm virtual welcome to Professor Robert S. Davis.
Thank you, ma'am. Can you hear me all right?
Yes,
Okay, very good, very good. All right, researching a Revolutionary War ancestor, first off in the broadest term. Revolutionary War research is complicated. Many records have not survived, and the records that do survive vary from state to state and sometimes even from county to county. It is very different. Revolutionary War research in New England is very different than it is in the South. And Revolutionary War research in Pennsylvania, very different, looking for your Patriot or his widow in Kentucky. It varies widely. What we're going to talk about now is Revolutionary War research in the South, which for many people, as in comparison to New England, for many people find to be particularly difficult. All right, first off, why would you want to go looking for your Revolutionary War ancestor at all? That was so long ago. That was so many generations back that even with DNA, it's the information is limited. Well, you might want to join a really cool group like the Daughters of the American Revolution or the older Sons of the American Revolution. Become a member of either, you have to trace your blood lineage back to a Revolutionary War veteran or to someone who contributed to the cause of American liberty from 1775 to 1781. Now, not all of our ancestors all of the time supported the American cause. I have an ancestor, for example, who is identical with the character in the movie The Patriot, in all that happened to him, except he was not a patriot, he was a Tory, was a loyalist. And if you're just shocked and appalled at that, understand that by my estimate, there's probably at least 250,000 Americans living today who are also his descendants. So, and particularly in the South, do not be surprised if at one time your ancestor was a patriot, and at another time your ancestor was a loyalist. But by the way, if you're planning to join the DAR or the SAR, don't bring up the part about when they supported the King's cause. Now, most of us get into genealogy in order to know where we come from, know something about who we are. But unfortunately, it gets to be so much fun filling out those forms and charts and the rest of it that it becomes more like filling out crossword puzzles than doing your research, than understanding people. That's why it's always a good thing in any epoch, any time period, step back for a moment and learn something about the world your ancestor lived in and experienced. And with all this going on in this country right now, I think that is particularly important. But we have more and more books out on the American Revolution, the period of the American Revolution, what it meant, things your ancestors would have seen, your ancestors would have experienced. Even if your ancestor was private nobody, your ancestor was not one of the big wigs, but he would have seen the big wigs. He would have been a part of the greater cause. And so when you find out who your ancestors were, your Revolutionary War ancestors were, male and female, black and white, whatever, whoever they were, make some effort to find some of these broader books that will tell you something about the world they lived in. Now, this is the part I always have a trouble with military records. People think that military records only exist to provide proof of military service. Hardly that. You can find tons of genealogical data in Revolutionary War records and in military records that survives nowhere else. I'm talking about proof of marriage. I'm talking about date of birth. I'm talking about proof of death. I'm talking about relationships between brothers and sisters. You can find all this wonderful stuff in these records. Problem with military records is that the information is never consistent. I might find your proof of your ancestors. I might find proof of your ancestors' marriage, but not be able to prove the proof of marriage of my ancestors. Military records are awfully inconsistent on their personal information. But, like I say, once in a while you find a real gem. Now, part of the problem with researching your Revolutionary War ancestors in the South is that we've got a really bad reputation in this regard. Let me back up a little bit. From the very beginning in this country, the textbooks in this country, the school books, were published in New England. They're still published in New England today. And then and now, they are prejudiced as far as history goes with New England. That's why you've heard of Paul Revere's Meaningless Bride. That's why you've heard of the Battle of Bunker Hill and the Boston Tea Party. But you've never heard of the Charleston Tea Party. You've never heard of the Comte d'Estaing. You've never heard of Sergeant Jasper, who were also important figures in the American Revolution. Because, as I say, the textbooks are published in New England, and so they're going to tell us American history. Anyway, the story gets started that the South was a backwater where the American Revolution was a sideshow that only went on the last years of the war, after the war was pretty much decided. Then there's a matter that the myth is that Loyalists and Tories, even though some of them may have well been your ancestors, this myth that Loyalists and Tories are always evil, but the Patriots and the Whigs are always the good guys. And you even see this in the movie The Patriot. Like I said, it is a very false image. African Americans always served on the side of or escaped to the British Army. Actually, more African Americans served in George Washington's army, served in the British Army. Now, yes, tens of thousands of African Americans did escape to the British lines. They were escaping to the British lines to escape slavery, not to join the British cause. And in fact, some of them, after reaching the British lines, they found conditions there so bad, they deserted the British, went back to their Patriot owners. Then there's a myth that the American Revolution was fundamentally different revolutions in Cuba, France, Mexico, Russia, etc. And that is one of the biggest myths in American history. The American Revolution laid the blueprint for the later Cuban, French, Mexican, Russian revolutions, etc. But we want to believe our revolution was cleaner and purer than everyone else's. Revolutions are dirty affairs. They are also inevitable affairs. Revolutions are all about change, and the change is not created by a few individuals. It's created by the economic circumstances, times. Forgive me, that's the history professor in me coming out. All right, now let's look at the truth about the American Revolution. Georgia and South Carolina supplied the rebels in Boston with food and gunpowder from the beginning of the war. The war was fought from 1775 to 1782, and in the South, this involved Americans of all races, British, French, Germans, Haitians, Indians, and Spaniards. Believe it or not, a Spanish army from Texas conquered the Gulf of Mexico, Spain, in support of the American Revolution, and that the Spanish provided us with badly needed money and supplies, as well as these campaigns against the British Gulf of Mexico. The second major British defeat was at Charleston, South Carolina, June 28, 1776. And I heard the other day on television that more Revolutionary War battles were fought in New Jersey, or maybe it was Pennsylvania, than in any other state. That simply is not true. South Carolina has more Revolutionary War battlefields than any other state. Over 300 of them. Between 1780 and 1781, South Carolina, all by itself, had 1/5 of all battle deaths and 1/3 of all wounded for the whole war in just that 1 year. But what is amazing is that almost all these losses came Americans fighting Americans, the American Revolution. Major battles in the South in the American Revolution, these included Savannah. Savannah had 2 battles, Briar Creek, Charleston, which had 2 sieges, Camden, Cowpens, Guilford Courthouse, and Kings Mountain. And if I thought about it, I would add to that, and the siege of Yorktown. French and American soldiers fought together against the British in Savannah, 1779, and at Yorktown in 1781. The Spanish siege of Pensacola, Florida, longest siege in North American history. Americans would change politics during the American Revolution, and sadly, atrocities were committed by all sides in the American Revolution. In the South, the American Revolution was a true civil war. The last major battle of the American Revolution was not at Yorktown, Virginia, but it was at Eutaw Springs, South Carolina, although both battles were fought in the South. Now we've got all the warm and fuzzy stuff down, all eager to find our Revolutionary War ancestor and how he fits in the family tree, or she fits in the family tree, and to find out what they saw and where they were. Okay, here's the problems we're going to be facing. Many records were not created or have not survived, particularly in the South, where so much of the war was a guerrilla war. Guerrillas do not keep good records. Most records that survive are not in the National Archives. Now, I do not know how many times somebody has come to me and said, I want to join the DAR, but I can't because I wrote to the National Archives and they couldn't find any record of my ancestors. Believe me, for every Revolutionary War soldier who appears in the records in the National Archives today, I would guess there's somewhere between 10 and 100 for whom there are no records at the National Archives, and you need to go to state archives. Many undocumented sources, such as the list of Kettle Creek soldiers, are usually only someone's guesses or presumption. Now, Kettle Creek was a Revolutionary War battle fought near Washington, Georgia, that I'm very close to indeed. However, in the old days, the people who were trying to save the battlefield, they made up these lists of people they thought might have been at the battle. And these lists have no documentation. The lists are just about useless. But still, people come to Georgia from all over the country because they saw their ancestors' name on a list of Revolutionary War patriots at Kettle Creek, and they want to find the proof behind the list. And far more often than not, they're disappointed. To give you some idea of how big the problem is, there are 450 patriots who are on the Kettle Creek list. The thing is, there were only 340 patriots in the battle. All right, now this is the problem. The third point here is a problem we all have, and this is whether you're looking for your New England patriot or your Kentucky patriot or your Florida patriot or wherever your patriot was from. If you're trying to get into the DAR or the SAR, there are 2 areas where you're going to have problems. First, you're going to have a problem proving the generation right after Revolutionary War soldier. That is, the child of the Revolutionary War soldier, proving that generation. And then there's a hole in family research in America. Using the 1850 census, we can usually pretty well figure out our family tree back to about 1800, thanks to the 18th federal census. Our problem comes going 1800 further back. So you have 2 major challenges. First is a generation after your Revolutionary War patriot, and the other is a generation around 1800. Now, I cannot give you any special fixes. I have the same problems with this that everyone else does. But maybe some of the records we're going to list following slides will help you with your particular problem in getting past these humps. All right. Now, There was a book put out by a man named Mason Weems. He wrote a book called The Life of Washington, where he invented the story of the cherry tree and a lot of other stories just to fill space. He also wrote a book called The Life of Marion, which was a biography of Francis Marion that was so bad, Francis Marion's men wrote their own biographies of Marion just to denounce this romance. Anyway, the people in America didn't know that The Life of Marion was largely a romantic novel built around the real life of Francis Marion. So, anyway, for this reason, they named all thousands and thousands of children Francis Marion, John Newton, and William Jasper after the heroes in this book. Anyway, you're an old man, you've outlived everybody, and nobody can. And your grandson said, "Did you know Francis Marion served in the American Revolution?" And so your ancestor wants his grandson to be proud of him. So he says, "Yes, son, I was with Francis Marion. I was." However, you, the modern genealogist, several times great-grandpa, was full of it. He wasn't even born at the time of the American Revolution, or he was a child during the time of the Revolution. But anyway, Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, was so popular that lots of old-timers falsely claimed to have served under him. Then we finally have the problem that people do not want to talk about ancestors served on the king's side, who remain loyal to the king, fought on the British side. And so that's just something that's not talked about. And the prejudice after the American Revolution against Americans who supported the king, British cause, was just horrific. And so, as I said, people rewrote their Revolutionary War past. So their ancestors who were Tories suddenly become patriots, or they weren't in this country at the time, or they just bury the family history about being loyalist so deep no one can find it, that no one can find it. All right, now let's talk about a few nationwide sources that you can check. Of course, this would apply to Kentucky or New Jersey, New England, or anywhere that your Revolutionary War ancestor might have lived. This country gave itself as a birthday present in 1976 a huge project, microfilm and index all of the papers of the Continental Congress. It was a huge project. The paper index is 5 volumes long, and it is magnificent. In that, you can find original muster rolls that mention your ancestor. You can find petitions your ancestors signed on. You can find your ancestor mentioned for any number of reasons in the thousands and thousands of entries in papers of the Continental Congress. The 5-volume index to the papers of the Continental Congress is widely available, and so is the microfilm. In fact, you will probably find a copy of the index and the microfilm to which it refers to at your nearest National Archives regional branch. Also, I could be mistaken. Wait a minute, I beg your pardon. It's also on the subscription site Fold 3. And Fold 3 has free access. And now this is a really strange story that comes out of all of this. The Federal Pension Office was afraid that there were people who had died who were Revolutionary War pensioners, but the family was still collecting the checks. So in 1840, the Pension Office asked the federal census takers to ask if anybody in any household was a Revolutionary War pensioner. Then what they were going to do was compare the list of pensioners from, which is what they published in 1840, to the pensioners who the Treasury Department was actually paying pensions. And this way they were going to catch fraudulent cases. Well, this went completely kabooey. It went the other way around. Instead of finding more Revolutionary War pensioners paying pensions, they found more Revolutionary War veterans that were drawing pensions. In other words, the census taker would ask, was there anybody in the household who's a revolutionary? And somebody, well, Joe Blow probably is. Census records are always, the information census always comes from neighbors, not from the family. Always act on that principle. Well, actually, the person was not a Revolutionary War pensioner, or he couldn't prove his service and never drew a pension, or he didn't want a pension. Believe it or not, there's some people who had the opportunity for pensions and decided against it. But anyway, the persons who show up in the 1840 federal census who were drawing a pension and show up in the census, they are in this book. The book is widely available on the 18th census of Revolutionary War pensioners. However, know this about the 1840 census when you're using it. If the person was listed as a Revolutionary War pensioner, but they were not in fact drawing a pension, then they will not show up in this book. They will show up in the census record as Revolutionary War veterans. Now, there are wonderful sites out there, such as Ancestry, Poll3, Genealogy Bank, that contain tons and tons of Revolutionary War records. We'll talk about some more of these in a moment. Many public libraries will give the public free access to these websites. All right. Books of documented Revolutionary War soldiers have been published for many states. The books on Virginia soldiers of the American Revolution fill an entire bookshelf. And these even include veterans who settled in Alabama after the war. So check at the state archives, check at the really large genealogy libraries near you for books of published records of Revolutionary War soldiers, veterans from the states where your ancestors served. Okay, always check the archives of the state where your ancestors served and local records in the county from which you served. And you can be very pleasantly surprised. This is where most of the records that survive Revolutionary War service can be found. All right, each state can have individual records unique to that state. For example, Georgia is the only state that had land lot lotteries. And in these land lot lotteries, sometimes Revolutionary War veterans or widows of veterans were given extra chances. Unfortunately, those soldiers and their widows were not expected to explain where the soldiers served or under whom they served, only that they did serve. And that can be hugely frustrating. Lloyd Boxstruck did a book, Revolutionary War Bounty Land Grants Awarded. It was mentioned by our host at the beginning of this program, awarded by the state governments. This is land that was given by 9 states of Revolutionary War veterans or their survivors. Now, if you find someone in Lloyd Boxstruck's book, then contact the appropriate state archives, learn what records are available. Now, Lloyd did a first-rate job on his book, but these records tend to be so complicated and convoluted that it's possible, let's say, go to the Georgia land grant record, find proof state of Georgia giving your Revolutionary ancestor land grant, and for some reason, Lloyd missed them in his book. Now, the Continental soldiers who served for the Continental Congress, they were owed land for their service, but they never received it from the Continental Congress. So they were, eventually, some of them were paid what was owed to them, land they never received. The records of the Revolutionary War bounty land Continental soldiers is abstracted in a set of books called the American State Papers. And the American State Papers have been scanned and indexed on the free site Making of America, Cornell. All right, state genealogical periodicals, sometimes even local genealogical. They are great for publishing oddball records never otherwise know about of Revolutionary War service and even family connection to Revolutionary War service. So let's say your ancestor served from South Carolina. Sure to check the back issue of South Carolina magazine of ancestral research. Your ancestors served in Virginia. Check the back issues of Virginia Genealogy or the Journal of Virginia Genealogy. Anyway, check the state journals, genealogical journal, and as I say, sometimes the local journals, and you will find the most wonderful stuff there of obscure records what people have found. Let me throw this in too while I've got a chance. Let's say in doing your research, you find some record that would be value to other people. You find a Revolutionary War record or a series of letters that talk about neighbors and marriages and whatever. Publish those in the appropriate state genealogical journal. You won't be paid for what you contribute, but it'll be wonderful because it will help people out, people who will never themselves come upon these records. I know I've only done that several hundred times myself. All right, there's a nationwide bibliography, although it is not current, to genealogical articles, and this is called the Periodical Source Index, or PERSI for short, and it's at findmypast.com, the internet. Okay, contrary to a myth, the Americans who served in the American Revolution and fully intended to be paid for their service. I hope that doesn't make them look less patriotic in your eyes, but that's the bottom line truth. You know the old story that the continental money and the state money not worth anything? It must have been worth something because the soldiers to whom it was owed, they fought like the devil to get paid their service and their property that they lost in service they served. There's a published book. It was published by the DAR called Pierce's Register, which is a giant index of all the payments eventually made by the Continental Congress to the Revolutionary War veterans and their heirs for the property that they gave up in the war. And by the way, appearing in Pierce's Register get you into the DAR. Your ancestor appearing in Pierce's Register get you into the DAR or the SAR. Individual state archives have records, payments for property and service, and these include the North Carolina Revolutionary War vouchers and accounts audited. Those are great. South Carolina had stub indent books and also accounts audited. The Georgia payment records that have survived have been published. Now, usually the payment records are something like your ancestor was owed £1 and 3 shillings for militia service, or is owed £2 for a pig, something like that. But occasionally you find some little bit of additional information knocks you out of your tree. Like he received £4 service at the Battle of Burke County Jail, or writing dispatches for Washington, or for spy work for General Washington. Now, you may have wondered why this session is called The Strange History of Revolutionary War Records. Here's a really good example of it. Lyman C. Draper. Lyman C. Draper was born in New Hampshire. He lived all over the country. He spent his last years in Madison, Wisconsin. For reasons he never explained, he loved the history of the southern frontier, South in the American Revolution. And for 50 years, he researched the American Revolution in the South and in Kentucky. And he compiled monster files of records, as well as gathering lots of original records himself. Out of this, he published only one book, Kings Mountain and Its Heroes. The Lyman C. Draper collection is widely available on microfilm all over the country. It also has various guides and indexes in forms of calendars that are just hugely helpful. But don't be the least bit surprised if you look in the calendar of the Tennessee Kings Mountain papers, for example, and there you find letters from your ancestor about the Battle of Kings Mountain, or about your family written by somebody else because your family was at the Battle of Kings Mountain. Madge Brown published logically rich genealogical abstracts of Revolutionary War Veteran Script Act. Now, that is absolutely the worst title of a genealogical book I've ever encountered, because it does not tell you anything about this wonderful book. But in 1852, all of these descendants of Virginia Revolutionary War soldiers sued the federal government because their ancestors never got the land the federal government promised them in Ohio. So in Madge's book, you have the name of the Continental soldier from Virginia, and then you've got the entire family tree laid out 1850 down to 18. It was so amazing. I was once teaching a class of young college students. I was passing that book around. First person I passed the book to, he opened it up to his last name, and he nearly hit the floor. He said, "That's my family. That's where we're from. This is them." And so maybe you can be that kind of lucky too. That book, by the way, is fairly rare because Miss Brown only published 100 copies, and she refused to print any more. All right, African Americans, they say, fought on both sides in the American Revolution. They certainly fought on both sides in the South. And overall, there were about 3,000 African Americans served in the American Revolution, many of which served in order to get their freedom. For the South, Bobby Gilmer Moss has done the book African Patriots, Southern Campaign, and there are other books also available on Africa in the American Revolution. The Daughters of the American Revolution has published African American and American Indian Patriots of the. Okay, it and its supplements are on the DAR website and have free access on the DAR website. But these are absolutely magnificent documented books, documented records of African American and Native Americans fought on the side. African Americans who left with the British are often found in the book Black Loyalist Directory. However, you have to be very careful in using that book because the British did a lousy job of taking down the names. And sometimes you just have to go through it page by page. Many good books are also available on women in the American Revolution, particularly the books that were done by Eric Grunset, such as American Women in the Revolution. But most of the Grunset books give you the name of the female patriot. They tell you what books or articles that they found have been written about them. All right, estimated 170,000 men served at one time or another Patriot cause. Probably the actual number was a lot less than that because a man would serve for, say, 3 months, skip a year, and then come back for another 3 months and be counted twice. That sort of thing did happen. Some 80,000 of these patriots or their widows applied for federal pension and or bounty land. The current national debt of the United States began. Congress could not fund the pension under the Act of 1832. That's how far back our debt goes. All right. Now, post-Revolutionary War pension files that have survived and will be of huge genealogical value to you start in 1832, or at least 1818. However, Revolutionary War pensions have been given out since 1775. And Lloyd Boxrick has published a book, Revolutionary War Pensions Awarded by State Governments and by the federal government prior to 1814 and by private acts 1905. Now, the Revolutionary War pension files can be a tremendous source of information. You might, in a typical Revolutionary War pension file, the Revolutionary War veteran gives you his date of birth. He gives you the county and state where he was born. He gives you a heart-wrenching account of his service in the American Revolution. My ancestor, Elias Allred, he was with General Rutherford's North Carolina militia, when they were protecting General Greene's army from General Cornwallis's British troops in the famous Race to the Dam. And in his pension, Elias talks about how we saved General Greene's army, got them across the Dan River. And then General Cornwallis's army showed up. And that was the most incredible sight I have ever seen. Drums and the flags and the cannons and the red uniforms. It is at that moment we realized that we were on the south side of the river and the rafts for our getaway were on the north side of the river. It is at that moment that General Rutherford uttered those immortal words, "Boys, follow me to the rear and be quick about it." Anyway, Elias and his friends survived the day. Many, many thousands of descendants. Okay, also at a Revolutionary War pension, it is also typical pensioner to explain all the places since the Revolution. And if the widow files a pension claim, when he died and when she married him and what her maiden name was. And sometimes, rare cases, sometimes you even get some of the names of or other valuable information. These are the Revolutionary War pensions. Lists of federal pensions have been published from the 1790s to 1840. Many libraries have those books and also the website Fold 3. Fold 3 has the National Archives microfilm of final pension vouchers for Revolutionary War soldiers and widows. And this is where the soldiers received their last payment. Now, what is so valuable about that? Many of these Revolutionary War veterans and many of their widows died without a tombstone or a Bible record or any record that has survived to us when they died. However, by taking their last pension payment, you got at least a 3-month window, a 3 to 6 month window on when the soldier died or the widow died. And that usually gives you at least a year of it. Some Revolutionary War pension depositions were recorded in county records, but they never arrived in Washington, and therefore they're not at the National Archives. The claims are sometimes found in the county records and are published in sources such as the North Carolina Genealogical Journal, which has published all of these that they could find in their genealogical journal from the county records. Now, how many of these pensions are out there somewhere in county records that never made it to Washington and are not at the National Archives? In a very unscientific estimate on my part, I would say 2 out of every 5, or maybe 1 out of every 5 Revolutionary War pensions recorded in county records never made it to Washington and only survived county court minutes. Okay, indexes to the federal pensions have been published. Pensions for the 1818 and later went to patriots of any race and can be a gold mine of genealogical information, as we've already said. Now, when you are looking for Revolutionary War pensions, do not stop with your Revolutionary War patriot. Look for anybody with the same last name, served from the same state where patriot served from. Now, I'm not talking about Smith or Davis, Jones here, although you can try that if you will. I'm talking about more like Lingenfelder or something, or whatever. But here's the trick to this. Maybe your Revolutionary War ancestor and his widow did not live long enough to apply for a pension. But what about his brother? What about his brother? I once researched a Walker family on the coast of North Carolina. This guy was an illiterate cracker who lived in the swamp, but he did leave one record. He left a will naming his children, even though he had to sign the will by Mark, by X. I was going through North Carolina Revolutionary War pensions, Walkers, and lo and behold, I found another Walker, one county over, who did draw a Revolutionary War pension. And this was the amazing part to it. The names of his brother, of the names of the brothers and sisters were the same as were in the will of this other guy. But what's going on here? They were brothers. One died leaving a will, and one lived long enough to leave a revolution. Two brothers quite possibly married two. That wouldn't surprise me in the least. Now, there's a thing called the Germanic naming scheme, but you don't have to be to have used it or your ancestors have been German. In this system, the oldest male is named for the father's father. Second oldest male is son, named for the mother's father. The oldest daughter is named for the father's mother. The second oldest daughter is named for the mother's mother. The third son is named for the father. The third daughter is named for the mother. And then after that, it follows the system of oldest brothers and oldest sisters, and so on. Anyway, by taking this will and comparing it to the children mentioned in the Revolutionary War pension claim, I put together, hypothetically, that it's hypothetical, I put together this whole family for 3 generations. Whole family for 3 generations. But here was a real kicker in the deck. The man who left the pension, he gave his date of birth, he gave the county on the North Carolina coast where he was born. The other guy, the guy who left the will, I'm pretty sure he's only a few years difference in age between him and his brother who drew the pension. So if I have one brother who's born in such and such a county on such and such a date, where do I look for the rest of his family, including his parents and siblings and whatever? Yes, in that county where he was born at the time that he was born. Okay, transcripts of all federal pensions, 1818 and later, service in the South, are on the free website, Southern Campaigns of the American Revolution. And you can go to the site, Southern Campaigns of the American Revolution, and you can search transcripts of every deposition made by a Revolutionary War veteran or their widow drawing a pension from the South during the American Revolution. Now, because you can do word searches, you can also get the names of other people, particularly officers and such, that the Revolutionary War veterans served with. And, of course, if your ancestor was the officer, then the pension filed by one of his soldiers is your proof of Revolutionary War service, your officer ancestor. I had one instance of that. I had a William Grant, who was a lieutenant, South Carolina militia, served at the Battle of Kettle Creek. And in that, he named his captain who served in that. And that proved that the captain was also a Revolutionary War veteran. Of course, the captain was William Grant Sr. That's right, the captain was senior and his son was junior. I just said from both of them. Not to brag. All right, the federal pensions for 1818 and later are on microfilm at many libraries, and they are also on the subscription site free. Now, the problem with all these indexes, pensions, they do not include the depositions of witnesses unless the witness was in the Revolution. And some of the depositions, I don't know if he was in the American Revolution or not, but I've known him ever since I was an infant. Or I remember when the family moved here in 1820, things like that. So I hope the day will come someday every document in these Revolutionary War pensions can be indexed. All right. Now, various patriotic societies, such as the Daughters of the American Revolution, Sons of the American Revolution, keep files of applications by members. And usually these files are open to the public. Sometimes at the request of the person, they are not filed. They are not open to the public. Or in some cases, the Patriot turned out to be a Loyalist, so that file is closed for whatever reason. Most of the information in the hereditary files of the DAR and the SAR are completely open to the public. Now, you cannot go into the SAR on someone else's application, and you cannot go into the DAR someone else's application. However, the evidence that they cite in their applications, you can use those in your application. You can use the same evidence. And of course, you can use the same Patriot too, or a white or female ancestor who aided the American Revolution. The Daughters of the American Revolution originally published undocumented lineages of their members, and this went on until the 19th. These books are many research libraries and are in the subscription website Ancestry. The DAR stopped publishing the lineages in the 1960s because they had so many new members, they just couldn't do it anymore. The DAR has a spectacular research library, and I love the address. 1776 D Street, Washington, D.C. The library is open to everyone, and by the way, it is near the White House. Now let's talk about the National Archives and Records. And maybe I should have said something about this a little earlier in the presentation, but let's go with it now. Revolutionary War records held by the United States government have been lost in various fires. Much of what remains are records donated after the fires to help the Revolutionary War veterans in documenting their service. Many of the National Archives records for the American Revolution are on the subscription website Fold 3, and Fold 3 is available at many public libraries. The records of the National Archives beyond the pension records are almost all the well-indexed miscellaneous Revolutionary War collection of the War Department, which, as I said, largely donations from the public. Now, all of the miscellaneous Revolutionary War collection is scanned and on the subscription site Fold 3. Now, your ancestor, at least for a time, served and supported the king. All right, there are a lot of good records available for Loyalists, and it can help you fill out blanks in your family tree. Bertie June Clark published 3 volumes of military rosters of the Loyalists who served the Southern campaign, even if they came from New Jersey and New York, which some of their units did. Bobby Gilmer Moss published so many wonderful books. South Carolina Patriots also published biographical information on Loyalists known to have been at the battles of Kings Mountain, 96, and Moores Creek Bridge. Many American Loyalists filed claims to the British government for property loss because of their support of the king. These claims are abstracted in Peter Wilson Coldham, American Migrations, and Gregory Palmer's book, Biographical Sketches of Loyalists in the American Revolution. Now, remember, I mentioned my ancestor who was like the character in the Patriot, except that he was a Loyalist. His name was Jonas Bedford, and he was from New Jersey. Jonas Bedford, after his home was burned down by raiders, he was at the Battle of Kings Mountain fighting for the king, and he would fight for the king for the rest of the war. His Loyalist claim is wonderful because it is endorsed by all these prominent British colonial leaders, so endorsed by them. Anyway, his property was confiscated by the state of North Carolina for his being a Tory, but years later, North Carolina gave him back his property and allowed him to return from England. So I've got this rich Loyalist claim on him, and then I have his records here in North Carolina. And as I say, hundreds of thousands of Americans today descend from him. But he was one of the Loyalists who came back to America. And in fact, he didn't die in North Carolina until 1823. Many of the Loyalist claims are on microfilm in the genealogy collection at Wallace State College and in their respective state archives. Dr. D.B. Pruitt has published abstracts of sales of confiscated Loyalist land and property in North Carolina. Mary B. Warren has published a set of e-books on Georgia Loyalists. and even one ebook on Hessians and British soldiers in Georgia. Now, why would anybody be interested in British and Hessian soldiers who served in Georgia? Very good reason for that. Very good reason for that. Many of them, when the war was being lost, they deserted and went over to the American side. And many people, including myself, I descend from a Hessian named Johann de Wyss. By the time someone in the family could read and write, Johann de Wyss had become Jonathan Davis. So anyway, don't be the least bit surprised if you find out that your Patriot and Revolutionary War ancestor was a Hessian deserter, British deserter. And they were the ones who benefited the most, believe it or not, for their service in the Revolution. More than 100,000 Americans Loyalists moved to other parts of, and this is discussed in Carol Troxler's book. However, many of them will eventually come back to Georgia and the South, and many of them never left. They just made accommodations with their Patriot neighbors. They made accommodations for their Patriot neighbors and stayed on in America. And that makes for a wonderful family history, a real gem to put into your family stories. All right, you've come this far. What do you do next? Well, you've gathered as much information as you can on your Revolutionary War Patriot. So go to your library and find the books on the battles and campaigns, places where your ancestor lived during the American Revolution. And through those, explore the world in which he or she visit the relevant Revolutionary War battles and other sites. We live in a golden age. Not since 1976 has there been such a huge effort to save more and more Revolutionary War battlefields and land. And the Civil War Battlefield Trust is to thank for that. They've been raising money right and left to help local people in preserving their historic sites, including from the American Revolution. I received the good news just this morning that the Great American Defeat at Camden, South Carolina, is going to be preserved. And not only will it be preserved, it's going to have a visitor center, park trails, and all these wonderful things. I remember when the only things at Camden Battlefield was a beat-up historical marker and a broken monument to where the Baron de Kalb gave his life for our country. But anyway, Camden Battlefield is going to be preserved and expanded. And if you visit Kettle Creek Battlefield and many other Revolutionary War battlefields, the Civil War Trust has been there and is helping them out. I might add that the head of the United States Park Service is committed to a big project in the next few years to expand and network all the Revolutionary War battlefields from Charleston to Kettle Creek, both sides of the Savannah River, to improve them and connect them, create Revolutionary War trails. Consider joining patriotic, historic preservation, reenactment groups. And finally, I hope you find so much information and you find so many good stories and so much great information that you write a book, and you share found Tory and Patriot, Hessian and regular, Continental, whatever, politician, whatever. Share your ancestry with us. Back here. And I'll take some questions.
Okay, hold on. Let me turn on my camera. Okay, we got a couple questions here. Hold on one second. Let's see here. While I'm waiting, okay, if I invite the class to go ahead and send through the chat room any questions you have. In the meantime, I've got a couple things I'd like to ask. We do have some beginning students in my class right now. Could you define Hessian for them?
All right. Hessian it's a very poor word that comes from the period of the American Revolution. King George III ruled over a third of Germany, of today's Germany, and he asked the men there to enlist in his army to fight in America. And since most of the people who lived in Germany were dirt poor and had no opportunities and futures, young men enlisted in the king's forces right and left. Anyway, it was said that their rulers sold them, King George III. Yes, the rulers were paid these soldiers, but volunteers. Anyway, these were German soldiers who fought on the side of the king. They came from Hesse-Kassel, hence the name Hessian, but my ancestor came from New Hanover, as they say, and they were loyal subjects to the king. But they come to America, someplace like Georgia, or someplace like Pennsylvania, and there's a young man who's writing his PhD dissertation right now on the Hessians who deserted the British, stayed on in America to start families. And see, they got nothing but their pay serving for King George. They desert to the Americans. We pay them bounty money for deserting. We give them free land for deserting. And they get to settle in an already existing German community where they can marry a nice German girl, just the same background they have. The next thing you know, as in the case of Johann de Wies, you have a whole cabin full of kids. He was interesting, though. He didn't marry a good German girl. He married a good Scottish woman named Marston. He never learned English, and she never learned German. But they got along well enough to have a cabin full of kids.
Wonderful. Okay. Also, I know on your handouts that you gave, you did put your email address, so I assume that it's okay for any of my students to reach out to you directly?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Welcome.
Wonderful. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that was okay. And then
also, if you play back this presentation on one of the slides, my email address is on that.
Perfect. Thank you. And yes, we did record it. I just want to let the class know this will be posted on YouTube as soon as our marketing department finishes doing the editing. They edit the film for me every week. We talked a bit about the SAR and the GAR, and I happen to know that we have some GAR and SAR people logged in today. One of the most difficult challenges our students have when they apply for the SAR or GAR is when, of course, the records don't prove, the definitive record of birth, marriage, and death. And in those instances, the DAR allows you to build a supportive argument, using other items as proof, to indicate the record that's lacking. In your vast experience of doing genealogy over all these years, have you ever built an argument for the DAR or the SAR when a document is missing?
Oh, yes, ma'am. For 14 years, I was a private researcher before I got this gig here at Wallace State a very long time ago. But I'll tell you, for the same amount of money, I would have taken a beating rather than do someone's lineage chart for them. I kind of feel like Jim Rockford, who taught me the fundamentals of investigation, who said somewhere in heaven there's this sorting house, and they say this is going to be a Bob Davis file. And now here's been my experience. All right, you want to join the Daughters of the American Revolution? You want to join the Sons of the American Revolution? Whatever. Okay. You ask in the family, and there's dear old Aunt Myrtle who collected all this family information, or maybe it was Uncle Otto or somebody. You had a family genealogist, and you go through the papers. The papers show how you descend from George Washington or Patrick Henry or whatever, as this goes. All right, you go through this research, you put it all together, and it doesn't make sense. Jim Rockford would say it doesn't make sense because it's not supposed to. And the reason is Aunt Myrtle had it all wrong. Aunt Myrtle did not have the resources that we have, and Aunt Myrtle wanted so much to be a descendant or whatever. Anyway, I had this happen to me more times than I want to think about. So what I end up doing is I say, okay, let's just forget Aunt Myrtle or Uncle Otto or whatever. Let's just put that in a box somewhere. Maybe strike a match to it. What we need to do is start with your family tree. How far back know your family that we can document? And they say, fine. So what I do is, it's as if I never heard of Aunt Myrtle. And that's when I find the Revolutionary War Patriot. And I always find a patriot that they've never heard of. We didn't even know we had this family. And I said, well, here they are. And it's not George Washington, it's his brother William, or something like that. And wow. I mean, sometimes you get lucky that way. More often it's private nobody. Now, one of the biggest disappointments, however, is somebody said, well, the family story always was that we were closely related to Daniel Morgan. So, or some patriot or whatever, Alexander Hamilton, whatever. And you go through it and you just can't make the case. Maybe it is true, but you just can't make the case. So what you do is you say, okay, I can prove that you descend from private nobody over. So let's go with private nobody for now. And then later, if we can find the evidence, we'll file a supplemental that proves you're Alexander Hamilton, grandson, or Benjamin Franklin, whatever. And anyway, it's a big disappointment for people, but it does get them in the door. Now, that has been my experience, is that unless you've got a really good genealogist in the family, let's say Aunt Myrtle actually got into the DAR from her research, and her research is up to speed. Absolutely nothing wrong with you filing a few birth, death certificates, whatever, and you go in on Aunt Myrtle's research. But what I'm trying to say is the further back lineage research was done, the more poorly documented it will be, when it's going to be documented at all. And that's been my experience with it. But let me say this, it's also an awful lot of fun. I mean, this is the best part of genealogy. This is how you discover cousins on the internet you never knew about before, and you find amazing things about your ancestors and their service and whatever. For example, I discovered that I had a Revolutionary War ancestor named Sarah Boone, and I can't go in to Sons of the American Revolution on her father because her father was George Boone, and he died before the Revolution. But one interesting thing is, guess who Sarah Boone's nephew was? Daniel Boone. And anyway, her branch of the family were pacifists. They didn't serve in the Revolution, but nonetheless, isn't it wonderful to find out that you're cousin to Daniel Boone? And
Absolutely.
all the things that.
Okay, Joan wanted me to make sure that everyone understood that if you are stuck on your Revolutionary War Patriot application with lacking documentation, that the register for the chapter that you wish to join can always help you as well. However, I want to keep in mind that not everyone reaches out to the registrar. A lot of people do their own private research, filling out the application, and then a lot of times they'll get turned off because they come to a roadblock and they may not reach out to the local chapter. So I wanted to make sure that everyone understands that there are arguments that can be made when documents are lacking, especially on that birth, marriage, and death situation. There are other ways to support the argument.
Let me make one other point on that. I have many a time helped someone with their application, and I was ready to defend some controversial point to the death. I just knew they were going to hit me hard on this one, and so I was ready. And then that's not the point they hit me on. They hit me on something I completely unexpected. Okay, this person died in 1817. Where's their death certificate? We didn't have death certificates in Georgia in 1817. Well, did you check the newspaper? In the Indian country that they lived in, they didn't have paper. Anyway, that sort of a situation. But don't be surprised when that happens to you. It happened to me more than one. I wanted to make the point that not everyone joins, does their family research with the intention of joining a lineage society. So learning how to build a supportive argument in the event of missing birth, marriage, or death records, excuse me, is always a very wonderful talent that you want to work on and hone and make better. Because there are many books that I've read over the years on lineage where those records simply do not exist or were not able to be found despite an exhaustive search. And you simply have to understand that there are ways of making logical arguments to support your argument in favor of a particular event. Also, let's see here. What advice would you give if somebody had been denied a pension? Let's say their widow or themselves went ahead after the war ended and applied for a pension, but for some reason they were turned down. Like, for instance, I have an ancestor who did not show up to collect his pay, so they ended up denying him a pension. And so what do you advise for people in a situation like that? I mean, obviously the ancestor was in the war,
but for lack of records or lack of showing up to collect a paycheck prevents them.
Okay, well, that's basically the same problem you're going to face all across the board, and that is, as you say, a lack of evidence. And the DAR can be very understanding about that if you present logical arguments. So can the SAR even more so. But the first thing you need to do is determine why they were turned down for the pension. Most of the time they were turned down because they couldn't find any witness. Now that doesn't mean they did not serve. It just means that they could not find anybody who knew that they served. They could not find a record. Like, for example, the real men who served under Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. And conversely on that, I know there were people who got pensions who didn't deserve them, but they could find two friends who were willing to lie that they did serve. This is much more common in the Civil War pensions than in the Revolutionary War pension. And particularly a problem that you have with a widow is that a widow, she wasn't on the campaigns with her husband most of the time. In fact, she usually didn't even marry the old boy until after the war. So she's trying to explain what he did in the Revolution from recollections of a dead man. And that can be very difficult as well. And then there's some cases where soldiers were just, I read the most interesting book the other day on African American Revolutionary War pension. First-rate work, but it explained the problems the Black Revolutionary War veterans had. First off, many of them had moved so far from where they had served, there was nobody to witness for them. And then some of them, sometimes they had to deal with white officials who just did not believe them. And sometimes even a white widow will tell you a story, and you can't match the story up with the facts. Well, the reason is because facts are her story is garbled, or her story is true. It's just no way that the person reading this knows that events actually happened. There was a Black Georgia Revolutionary War soldier. His name was Nathan Fry, and he applied for a pension. And believe it or not, the federal judge he appeared before was John Marshall, who was the Chief Justice of the Board. And he had the most incredible story to tell about being a drummer and being the aide to General McIntosh, and then moving from Georgia to Valley Forge and the events and such that he went on. His pension was almost denied because nobody could find a record of him. But the records of the Georgia Continentals have survived. However, I believe every word the man said because I can back up almost everything he said. There was a soldier who said that he was a British Ranger before the war in Georgia, and then he was involved in this ambush on the border where almost everybody in his unit was wiped out. Everything he says in his pension, I believe, because I can prove every event he talked about happened. But his name never appears on any of the rosters anywhere. I can't find any record the guy was ever in Georgia. The story he told matches. Some of this stuff you're just never going to be able to explain. But basically it comes back to check every source that you can. And like I said, start with finding out why they turned them down and see if there was a legitimate reason. Was it they just couldn't do the service, or was it that the whole thing was fishy? Or they were in the Civil War, a common reason that people were denied their pension. They filled out all the paperwork. There were just a couple of stupid questions that needed to be answered, and they never answered them, often because they died before they had a chance. So, like I said, don't presume off the bat because they were denied a pension that they were being dishonest in any way. But that's just one more thing you're going to have to prove. And the fact that they were denied a pension, maybe that's something you do not want to bring up for application for the lineage society.
Great advice. One of the things that I've really been stressing in my class for the last 3 years is to write your own book. And I've had some wonderful guest speakers in the past that talk about how to write your own book. and about how you don't have to be like another author. You're the creator of your book. So you put into the book, what you want. I mean, you are the creator of that material. Because I think the biggest obstacle that my class faces, and probably not just my class, but many people when it comes to writing a book, is fear of writing, and the fact that they've never published before. And as a matter of fact, I did publish for those who've been coming to my class for a while, just as a sample, I published a very small book, and I did it through a company called Printer Picks, and see how small it is. It's only 40 pages. And it's a self-published book, and it was very easy to do, just kind of like, showing how easy it is. But anyhow, I got the cost down to this book to be about $5-6 a book. It was really easy to, the software nowadays to self-publish is very user-friendly. The cost of self-publishing now is very, very cheap. So you don't have to do that 250 or 500-page family history book. So I would encourage everyone, to kind of, reinforce what Robert was saying is publish. You do not have to publish a big book. It doesn't have to be, years and years and years worth of your research. In my particular case, the book I published, it was just two generations out of my family tree. It was, very easy to do. And very cheap to do. So I would encourage, I want to second what Robert just said, please consider publishing. And, if you want to learn how to write better, our library has lots of books on how to write your own genealogy books if you'd like to, follow a more traditional path of writing. So, write, publish. That's my biggest advice for everyone. Also, you had mentioned at the beginning of your presentation about Lineage Society and Genealogy Society newsletters. We've talked about this in my class before, the value of you yourself writing for your local lineage society or for other lineage societies. I myself actually belong to many lineage societies and genealogy societies all over the country, just simply because I like supporting them. Usually I go for where my ancestors live because, that's where I usually reach out for help, and you can usually find a free volunteer in the genealogy society. But anyhow, I wanted to say you mentioned about looking at these old newsletters for genealogy organizations, and I wanted to remind everybody that many of these are available for free on the Internet Archive and also on Family Search, and even in our own library. EBSCOhost, which is one of our subscription databases, actually has some Nevada newsletters for genealogical societies as well, back issues. And of course, I want to remind everything that not everything is digital. Just because you can't find it in digital format doesn't mean that it's not out there. And Robert talked a little bit about Percy earlier, and I would encourage everyone to get to know Percy a little bit more than if you are not familiar with it. So with that, let's see here if there's any other questions. Let's see here. Getting some people saying thank you. Louise would like to know what book about African American author. Can you go back to that slide, or do you know the author's name offhand?
Bobby Gilmer Moss for the South Carolina. For African American soldiers, Patriot soldiers in the South, that was a book by Bobby Gilmer Moss.
And didn't you mention also that the DAR has one on their website?
Yes, ma'am. You go to their website, and it's there, and also the supplement to it is there as well. And it's not just Native African American soldiers, but also Native American soldiers of the American Revolution. And that's on there, and it's free on their website. The books that they did on women, I do not believe are on their website. They may be. I could be wrong about that.
Wonderful. Okay, I'm just scrolling through the chat box here to see if there's anything else. Let's see here. Robin would like you to repeat the Germanic naming process once again.
Okay, I keep calling it that, and I've got to stop calling it that because it confuses. But Scots used it, and the English used it, and French used it. Everybody used it. But back then, before we had cable, what we had were babies, lots of them. And so what families would do to solve the problem of naming them, the eldest male, the oldest son would be named the father's father. Now, the second eldest son would be named for the mother's father. The third eldest son would be named for the father. The The fourth eldest son would be named for the father's oldest brother. The fifth oldest son be named for the mother's oldest brother, and then so on down the line. Now, for the women, it was supposed to be reversed, but it never was. The oldest daughter was always named for the father's mother. The second oldest daughter was always named for the mother's mother. The third oldest daughter was named for the mother, and the fourth would be named the father's oldest sister. Fifth daughter would be named for the mother's oldest sister. Now, there are problems with this. For example, what if the baby dies? What if you don't have a complete list of the children? And what if a baby died? Well, it was another tradition they had that if a baby died, next baby of that sex named the same thing. That took care of that problem. And then what if the father and the grandfather had the same name? Well, anyway, you can imagine the problems that all this can be causing. I once researched an iron founder born in Scotland, who worked in Macon, Georgia, built a huge industrial complex. His problem, however, was he never talked about his life in Edinburgh. But I had his family Bible record. And because I had his family Bible record, and I knew his wife's family from Pennsylvania, and I could match the names of her siblings to the Bible, I figured out they were using this Germanic naming scheme. And so I could give you his entire family, Water of Leith, Edinburgh Parish, Scotland, even though I never found a record of, including his mother's maiden name, because these were the names he gave his children using this naming.
And that could also be an interesting clue if you're at a brick wall, of where to go out, elsewhere to look for people's the generation before that you cannot link. I've actually been using that process for several years now, trying to break through a brick wall that I have, because simply I've been working on this brick wall for so many years, and I'm just stuck. So yes, I'm having to reach out in that direction myself at this point in time, trying to break through that brick wall. So with that, let's see here. I don't see any other questions. So I'll give the class just a few more seconds to write any questions they might have. I did go ahead and post all the links that I talked about at the beginning of class in the chat room. And I want to remind everybody that if you do want to download the chat room, there's 3 little dots at the bottom of the chat box, and it just says download chat, and you can go ahead and do that if you want all the links right now. Let's see here. Joan wants to know, let's see here. Joan wants to know, did he say we can get a list of soldiers that fought in the Battle of the Cowpens?
Not that I know of. I do not know of any list of fought at the Battle of Cowpens, but a few years back, an excellent heartbeat by heartbeat account of the Battle of Cowpens published. And the name of the book is A Devil of a Whipping. Devil of a Whipping. But it was just an outstanding book. It won't tell you the broader picture of the war, but it will tell you where every unit at the Battle of Cowpens was at any given moment. Now, each national park these days has a soldier system where you go there and you type in a name into a computer. I think you can do this online too at the park, and they will tell you if they've got a record of that soldier being there. And in most cases for a Revolutionary War battle, all you're going to have your ancestor's unit. Well, they can type in the unit too, and you can see right on the battlefield where your ancestor fought. This is particularly good for the Civil War, but I'm sure the Park Service is doing it for the American Revolution too. And Cowpens battlefield is just absolutely incredible. And the Park Service is making a huge effort right now to restore the battlefield back the way it looked when Daniel Morgan defeated Bannister Tarleton that day in one of the great battles of the American Revolution. It's well worth going to see.
And I would encourage everyone, as soon as the virus passes, to go ahead and visit those battleground parks. Of course, they're very, very, very interesting. In fact, I've been reaching out to Gettysburg for years now, trying to get one of their park rangers to do a presentation for me, but I've not been able to book anyone at this point. I will continue to try, because I think that's one of the great battlefields from the Civil War, of course, but that my students could benefit from. So I will continue to work on that. So let's see here. I'm getting a lot of people saying thank you and that they will reach out. Let's see here. Connie wanted to say not only thank you for your presentation today, but also for the last one you did in April on the Civil War history. So, once again, thank you, Robert. And Robert, what I'll do is I'm going to let the class know, if there's no other questions, that they can begin to sign out. But we do have another hour of class. The class goes until 2 p.m. So if there's any of my students who'd like to stay online and work with me one-on-one on their family trees, I'm more than happy to sit with you and work either individually or in groups online. So with that, Robert, if you'd like to sign out, all you'd have to do is click on that red hang up button. And once again, thank you very much for another wonderful presentation. My students and I greatly appreciate it.
You're most welcome, ma'am.